We have a saying in our professional sport, and that is you're no good sitting in the grandstand. So we don't want you up in the grandstand. We need you participating. We need you at your best to be able to perform. And that's terribly, terribly important. And I know that for example, that in most sporting clubs, and especially when I was growing up, you've got the doctors, you've got the physios, you've got the trainers, you've got dentists, you had everybody like that. But I do want to talk a little bit along the lines of what's gone on here today, is that I think we need to actually even take that a little bit further, because it can go deeper than the physical. And I learnt this probably in my period of playing, and obviously you can tell by the colour of my hair, it was quite some time ago. But I played for a club called Melbourne Football Club. And I was there for 13 seasons, and I played something like 236 games, and we didn't enjoy great success. We never really got to the top. I could never really understand it, because when I looked at our playing personnel, we weren't far off the best, but we just didn't seem to be able to make it. And I couldn't understand the reasons why. At 31 years of age, I got a chance to go to another club, and that was a club called North Melbourne. And when I went there, I probably got my first insight into just the difference, and that difference. Because when I got there, what I come to find out was that it's more than talent and ability. It's also the capacity to provide an environment where people want to be and feel that they are respected and are wanted. And it's an environment where they actually gave to you first before asking you to perform. And you felt in some ways obligated in that situation, which was different from where I'd come from, because there it was all about you perform, and once you perform, we'll look after you. So it was in reverse. And there were two little areas that I'll share with you that stood out to illustrate this and made a massive change on me and where I would go from that day on. Firstly was that I came in there and I got this, they introduced me to the dietitian. Now, we had not had a dietitian, but this dietitian was different. This dietitian was different, was not only did she go through and explain all the food types and everything like that, but she took it further than that. We had a lot of young fellows who were recruits from the country. She actually took them shopping. She took them shopping and she taught them the sort of foods to look for. She then ran cooking classes, but not only for them, then she ran cooking classes for the wives and stuff like that. So now we were embracing. So it was not about telling people, it was about providing them with the tools to be able to do that and an understanding. Because quite often, people don't do these things because they don't know how to do it. And so we've taken an environment. But even more than that, the one that stood out to me was this. I met so many people. I met the coaches, I met the board, I met everybody there. And then one man came up to me. He was only a small man in stature, but big. He came up and he said, "You need to know me, I'm very important to you." And I said, "Why?" He said, "My name is Norm Bravo." And I said, "Who are you, Norm?" And he said, "I'm your new granddad." I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, "I'm your new granddad." I said, "Well, what do you do?" He said, "I do everything that will be important to you, and you'll come to find out." Now, I didn't see much about him until probably a couple of months later, when we'd gone through our pre-season and we played a game of football. It was my first game for this club. And I got a phone call from him on the Friday before the Saturday game. And he said to me, "Congratulations, you're in the team." "Yes." And he said, "What time have you got to be at the team meeting?" And I told him it was about 11:30. The game started about 2. He said, "How are you getting there?" I said, "I'm going to drive." He said, "That's fantastic." And then he said to me, "What about Judy and the kids?" I said, "They'll come with me." And he said, "Well, what will happen?" I said, "Well, they'll sit in the car and wait for me until I've had the meeting and I'll come and get them, bring them in." He said, "No, you won't." He said, "You get yourself there, I'll look after Judy and the kids." And so what would happen in those situations, I would go off and then he would organise somebody to come and pick them up at a reasonable time and drive them. And he would drive them to the game, and at the game they would be taken to special places where they'd have their own seats and they'd sit for dinner and everything like that. When the game was over, Norm would organise them to go into the players' function with the wives and girlfriends and everybody to be there, so that therefore when I came out, they had been looked after. About halfway through the year, I got a phone call from Norm. He said, "Stan, can I ask you this question?" I said, "Yes, mate." He said, "When's the last time you took Judy out to dinner?" And I said, he said, "Yeah, I guessed that." He said, "Wednesday night you're booked into this restaurant so-and-so at 7:30. The car will be there to pick you up." I said, "What about?" He said, "The babysitter will be there looking after the kids." If you ask my wife and my children, where's your happiest time in football, where do you think they say? because what they knew, they embraced the whole family. And it was a critical component because just those two little things meant this was an environment where I not only wanted to be and felt comfortable to be, but so did everybody. And so they set a mechanism. And it was interesting because when I first got there, they talked about, welcome to the North Melbourne family. You're about to embrace the shinboner spirit. Now, I'd heard so much about shinboners. Apparently back in their history there was something about shinboners, but everybody tried to work out, what is this shinboner spirit? This shinboner spirit is we embrace the whole family and we look after you and we will give in that situation. So it was creating that environment, that culture, that sort of things that you start to hear about, where they put people first, but more importantly, you wanted to be and you felt comfortable in doing in that situation. This was, in my mind, creating an environment conducive to success by looking at all these other things and giving the tools. So you can imagine, as I went through my career and got an opportunity to coach, how all of a sudden I started to change. And when I walked into that environment, and any new environment, obviously I was looking at things along the lines of what had happened to me and presented to me before. And so therefore we did a couple of things in my first time at St Kilda. The first thing we did is we ran an orientation day. And at that orientation day, we went to Monash University. And at that was every player, every wife and every girlfriend, everybody involved with the club, no matter what, trainers, etc., plus all their wives and partners. And as we sat in this auditorium, they were asked to sit in their groups. And as they sat in their groups, what happened is that we would get somebody to stand up who represented that group, and that person would say, for example, if they were the training group, chap stood up and he said, my name's Ken Whiffen, I am the head trainer, I'd like you to introduce you to Dennis Campbell and so, and he went on and introduced everybody. So it was the whole organisation got to see these people, and then he then said, I will now tell you why we are important to this club. And he did that, and of course there was a round of applause. We got through to the situation where all of a sudden we came to the wives and girlfriends, and this girl stood up and said, my name is Fiona Burke, I'm the wife of the co-captain Nathan, and I'd like to introduce you to, this is Judy Alves, the coach's wife, and so-and-so. This is so-and-so, she's going with Matthew Lappin, it's his latest girlfriend, and so on went through. And then she said, and now I'd like to tell you why we're the most important people in the club. And everybody laughed. And she said, don't laugh, because if these guys aren't happy at home, they won't perform. And so therefore was that recognition and that credit that we started to give within that whole thing became important. Judy obviously became important because she'd had this fantastic experience. So Judy now became the conduit between me, the playing group, and the wives and girlfriends. She organised the same things like Norm Bravo did. So she set that situation up to make that happen. But more importantly, I came to find out things that I needed to hear. And that was who was having problems at home, who was in those little areas. Because so often what happened, when I looked at a player, I looked at what's wrong with his form, the physicality, when so often it could be in a situation. And I'll give you one little case in point. It was mentioned about this person was struggling, and Judy said, I think you need to have a talk to him at home. The girls have told me. And I said, what? She said, I'm not going to share it with you, but I think you need to go there. So the girls knew this, but the coaches, we didn't know this. So I went round to where this boy was boarding. I spoke to the lovely people who were looking after him, and I went upstairs and I opened the door to talk to him, and I found him naked, sitting in the corner, rocking in the fetal position. I got a blanket and I went and put around him. And I just said to him, mate, what's the matter? And he looked at me and he blurted out, he said, I miss my mum. He was homesick. He was a kid, 20, 21 years of age, who was homesick. A country kid had been pushed away. And I said, why didn't you tell me? He said, because you would have thought I'm weak. So in this situation, so I talked to him and said, what do you want? And we talked about different things. I said, look, pal, I'm going to tell you, I'm happy for you to go home. He said, yeah, but if the guys know. I said, no, they won't know. So he made out that at next training session that he was injured. And I said, he's got a sore leg, he won't be playing this week. What I'm going to do, look, mate, you might as well go home for a few days. Go home as long as you like. He was back in 24 hours. He just needed to go home and see mum and dad and know that he could do that. And so therefore those type of things. In addition, we did something else, obviously. We brought mentors in. Why? Because it's so important. You can imagine you walk into any organisation, you're a new person, and you walk in, it is incredible. They all know you, but you've got 30, 40, 50 people. What do you want to do? You know what we found so often? You know the major problem? They didn't know where the toilets were. They didn't know what time you had lunch. They didn't know any of those type of things. So we paired them up with a mentor, somebody who was there to be able to guide them through, to provide that advice for them in that situation. And one other little one is just to continue to explore for different ways of making people better and implementing. And one thing which I think was fantastic and was seen with a lot of scorn was the fact that we taught them how to do meditation. Why? Because stress and the pressure in a game is incredible. And that just can get to people in so many ways. And what will happen is that, guess what, of a match day in our game, so often people role play because they think this is what they need to do. They'll jump around when the real is not what they really want to do. And so we taught them how to meditate, and we set up a room. And that was a dark room, and they could go in there and relax and meditate on game day. What we started to do was create an environment that gave them the best opportunity to be able to perform in those ways, and it was amazing. Because then you know what we did? We created a situation where people wanted to be, and we brought to them and added something that's so critical. It's a critical component. It's called confidence. When you have confidence, you'll start to produce your talent, and you'll start to do things that people didn't even believe you had a chance of being able to do. Because one of the important things of leadership, and I'll finish on this, leadership is to understand that in everybody there's a spark of greatness. Challenge of leadership is to find out what you can do to ignite that spark, and when you do that, you'll create an incredible bushfire, and you'll do what I call is you'll release the giant within. And boy, don't get in their way when that happens. Thank you.